Hi, and welcome back to Football Made Simple.
Two European giants faced off in the Champions League when Xavi's Barca faced Inzaghi's Inter. In the end, the match finished 1-0 to Inter thanks to a Çalhanoğlu goal. The XG showed that there wasn't much goal-mouth action, but why was Xavi unable to find the answer? And how exactly did Inzaghi shut him down tactically? This video will explain just that. And if you're into fantasy football, join me on Spitch, which is my favorite fantasy football app, and this is how my team looks this week. I like it because before the match, you can look in depth at a player's previous stats. And Spitch also cares about so much more than just goals and assists, letting you score points for passes, tackles, and so much more, so midfield players like Kovacic can actually score points. On top of that, you can join at any time because prizes are given out weekly and your scores reset weekly. If that sounds good, download it through the link in the description and join my community, FMS FC. Barcelona had almost all of the ball in this game, but that was completely by design for Inzaghi, who had a well-researched and well-prepared tactical plan. From goal kicks, Barcelona were generally able to get out fairly easily. But when they did reach the midfield third, if they only had a back two in Christensen and Garcia, Inter could press with their two centre forwards, making it a 2 versus 2 and applying a bit more pressure. But for the most part, to counter this, Barcelona actually built up with a back three, with Sergi Roberto tucking in from right back to be the third man, so that they had the 3 versus 2 advantage at all times. This was one of the rare occasions that Barcelona was building up with somewhat of a back two. And in this situation, Inter switched to a two-man press, with Barella joining from midfield, whilst Martinez would then drop deeper in order to cover for him, so they could apply a bit more pressure in this situation. But like many top teams choose to do, Barcelona actually built up in a 3-2-5, with Busquets and Pedri then forming the double pivot. Alonso, as a highly attacking wingback, would be happy to provide the width whilst Rafinha tucked in. Dembele is more of a traditional winger, so he could hold the width there, whilst Xavi pushed up higher. And Roberto is more of a ball-playing fullback, so he would be happier to stay deep than Alonso would be in a back three. And here, we see Roberto, Christensen and Garcia forming a back three, the double pivot of Busquets and Pedri, whilst the front five will consist of Dembele wide, Xavi, Lewandowski, who in this case is slightly wider, Rafinha and Alonso out wide. But unlike many teams who struggle against this formation, Inter show that there are ways to counter this, especially with their back five. The first step for Inter was to drop Correa and Martinez extremely deep so that they functioned almost as midfielders, meaning that even if Barcelona tried to drop Rafinha and Xavi deeper into the midfield, they would still have the 5 versus 4 advantage, making it extremely difficult for Barcelona to play through the centre. This also helped because with Correa and Martinez covering the double pivot, the half-space men, who often cause teams so much havoc between the lines, could be covered either directly by moving in behind them, but more often we saw them use their cover shadows, staying in front of their men so that they still had the mobility to come out and cover when needed. But Xavi is an intelligent coach, so he went through many iterations looking for the solution. But Inzaghi seemed to have an answer for every one. With a 3 versus 2 advantage, either high or with the forwards not involved at all, he looked to use his wider centre backs in the build-up extensively. So, suppose Roberto got on the ball, he would look to drive forward. And as discussed, by staying in front of their half-space men, the midfielders had more mobility, so they would be tasked with moving out towards the ball. So, this could hypothetically cause a problem with Barcelona able to get the ball to the man in the half space. But this wasn't the reality. Firstly, because the wingbacks were highly aggressive in staying on the winger, so that even when they did receive, they were more than likely facing backwards. But beyond that, having extra centre backs to go man to man meant that Bastoni in this situation would have the freedom to be highly aggressive and push up onto Xavi, so that even if he did receive, unless there was a bit of individual skill, he would be unable to turn and therefore be much less effective. Here we see a perfect example of that, as Roberto receives deep and has space to move forward as he is outside the pressing two of Inter. This means it's up to Mkhitaryan from midfield to then go and look and press Roberto. Dembele may be dropping deep towards the ball, but as discussed, the fullbacks could also afford to be aggressive on their man. So, when Dembele receives, he can't really turn, and at the same time Bastoni is being aggressive on Xavi, so it would be difficult for him to receive as well. At times we would see Lewandowski looking to drop in to create a little bit more havoc, but this isn't really the strongest suit of his game. But usually, a big advantage of the shape that Barcelona was using is the 5 versus 4. So suppose that Inter were using a back 4, that looks something like this. One advantage teams have when they move the ball wide to one side is that with a fullback on the wing back and the centre backs being forced to shift across, a man in the half space will be able to force the fullback to come across, thus allowing space for the switch. But this isn't the case with the back 5, as the side can still afford to be man-to-man, meaning that even if they do go for a switch, the winger is well covered. We did see Barcelona try to force this issue at times by exaggerating the left side overload, with Lewandowski shifting as far left as possible, thus dragging across to Fry. But even with Xavi occupying the half spaces, Bastoni would be happy to come central, and DeMarco would also be happy to hold his width, as they knew Barcelona didn't have runners who could take advantage of this space during this match. So here we see Barcelona being more aggressive with their side overload, as that's Alonso, Rafinha, and Lewandowski has come quite wide. Xavi has also come in quite central to try and open up space in this region. And Inter are happy to leave this gap between Bastoni and DeMarco, as they knew that Barcelona didn't necessarily have runners looking to take advantage of it. So when the ball does come to Dembele, he's already well covered. At times we did see Pedri looking to get a little bit more space away from the cover shadow of the forwards by dropping into this left side zone, and hopefully drawing a midfielder higher, whilst the man in the half space would get a little bit more space in which to operate. However, once again Inter were disciplined, as when the centre midfielder came out, he would try to use his cover shadow to cover that pass, and once again the centre backs were highly aggressive in either case, so that this pass was still difficult to make. So here we see that Pedri has come wider, potentially drawing Barella to him, whilst Rafinha has taken this opportunity to move even more central. But we can see that Barella is still conscious of the passing lane and looking to cut it off. But at the same time, the centre-back is already ready to press Rafinha if the ball does come into him, because he knows he has the safety of the extra centre-back being able to cover Lewandowski. And once again we see that Garcia does look for the switch, but because of Inter's natural shape, DeMarco is already in a great position to potentially cover him. But the 5 versus 5 higher up did mean that at times 1 versus 1s could be created. Down the left hand side that wouldn't be too dangerous, as Alonso can't really take on his man. So Barcelona looked to take advantage down the right hand side, with Dembele who's much better in 1 versus 1s. But for the most part DeMarco was able to cover him throughout the match. But the one disallowed goal for Barcelona did come when Dembele was successful in taking his man on. But again in the second half, Xavi looked to adapt once again. With Inter having the lead, they sat even deeper, dropping their midfielders on top of their defenders. So now with the forwards not interested in pressing at all, he switched to a back 2 of Garcia and Christensen, which would release Roberto a little bit more higher up the pitch, making it more of a 2-3-5 now. So in this scenario, when the ball had been wider down the left hand side and Barcelona were looking to enact the overload as discussed, we would see Roberto pick up positions here. And in general we saw that Roberto was able to get space just outside the box on the right hand side and would look to attempt crosses, but they were unsuccessful. The elite teams who play with this shape that Barcelona was using usually have an elite creator in this position. Think of Trent at Liverpool or De Bruyne and how many times they get assists from this region. So here we can see that Roberto is now a part of the midfield line. And with Barca chasing the goal, Xavi was looking to attack the box much more, taking Bastoni with him, and therefore creating more room for Roberto in which to operate in this deeper zone. So time and again Roberto was found here, but was unable to find a dangerous cross into the forwards. But Inter were also perfectly set up for the transition due to having a front 2. So when there was a turnover, as long as Inter were able to break this first line of pressure, it would mean that Inter would now have a 2 versus 2 against the centre backs. This was helped by having a highly physical centre midfielder like Barella, who would be looking to run beyond and create a 3 versus 2 at times, so Inter could look dangerous. So here we see that Barcelona are attacking, but on the transition, their line of 3 midfielders is broken. So now Inter have a 2 versus 2, and a midfielder is looking to join them as quickly as he can. But even in controlled build-up, Inter could look dangerous. Barca initially pressed with a quite interesting shape, with Lewandowski often being joined by Xavi, as well as Rafinha in pressing the back 3, whilst the wingbacks pushing high would drag Dembele high, whilst Darmian high would also pin back Alonso. At the same time, they looked to use Çalhanoğlu or Mkhitaryan as the deepest midfielder, whilst the others pushed much higher up. We could often see them shift into a front three, with Martinez coming central, Correa in the half space, as well as Barella on the far side. In order to cut out the deepest midfielder, Busquets would often have to push up initially, but this would leave Barcelona looking vulnerable at times in the midfield. So in the second half, Xavi dropped Gavi deeper so that Busquets could remain deeper as well. Lewandowski pushed central and Dembele became the third man. However, Inter were able to implement a plan that Barcelona tried much more effectively, as whenever they did find their wingbacks, Barcelona's own fullbacks were highly aggressive pushing up onto them. But now, this would look more like a remaining front four for Inter, so if Barcelona shifted across, there was always the potential to find the fullback, depending on which side they started on, with the big switch. So here we see the pressing three for Barcelona of Gavi, Rafinha and Lewandowski. And Busquets is high up, trying to press the deepest pivot. So, with Rafinha having been drawn high up in order to press in that front three, there is the potential for the switch for Inter. And when Darmian receives, he can look to drive forward. And here we see a similar pattern, with Rafinha having been drawn high. DiMarco receiving draws Roberto out of position, and as we can see, the positioning of Barella here means that Alonso is drawn infield. So because of the man advantage, there is now the potential for the switch out towards Darmian. And in fact we see some of all of this in the lead up to the goal. Once again we see a front three of Dembele, Rafinha and Lewandowski looking to press the back three, whilst this time it is Gavi on the deepest midfielder. The ball is played into the dropping centre forward, and when it goes back to DiMarco, Roberto is drawn out. And now we can see that Alonso is actually 2 versus 1 down against Barella and Darmian out of shot. So when he receives, the movement of Barella means that Alonso can't come out to press and has to drop deeper. So Darmian now has space to line up across, and after some failed clearances, this leads to the goal. Overall, it was an effective and impressive performance from Inter, who executed their plan perfectly, whilst Barcelona on the other hand couldn't find a solution. For this performance, Inzaghi earns a 9, showing that even without possession, you can have a well-executed plan. Whilst Xavi, on the other hand, earns a 6, as he did try a few different tricks, but was unable to find the solution. But what did you make of the match? Drop it down below.
But that's all for today, and remember, keep it simple.